Thanks everybody for coming. This is the second of 4 talks on major battles of the Second World War. This is Stalingrad. Stalingrad is one of those names that really causes, when you really know what went on there, really causes the hair to rise on the back of your neck. It was an incredibly nasty sort of experience and a real turning point in the war. I mean, the reason, as I sort of mentioned in my last talk about how I sort of picked these things, is that I wanted to pick battles that were really turning points. And Stalingrad was the sort of Waterloo, if you will, for Nazi Germany. I mean, we like to think like, Band of Brothers, D-Day, we, defeated fascism. My grandfather fought in the Second World War as a tank commander in Patton's Third Army. And and I don't mean in any way to diminish the service that a lot of Americans put in, and the fact that many of them gave the last full measure of devotion to the country. But the Russians really won the Second World War. I mean, the Russians really defeated Hitler. I think there's no two ways about this, and I think that people who really study the topic will confirm. I mean, that probably fewer than 500,000 Americans were killed, which is a lot. Between 20 and 25 million Russians were killed in the Second World War, and I mean, that's a lot of people. And this was really the sort of moment at which Hitler's, the problems with his management style, I guess is the most sympathetic way to put it, became most evident. And really he destroyed, in a lot of respect, the Wehrmacht. The Sixth Army, which was the sort of major element of this battle from the German side, were, in a lot of respects, his most veteran troops, the troops that had fought in France, the troops that had fought their way through the Ukraine. And they were destroyed utterly. So before we get to the serious part of our talk, or I shouldn't say this, before we get to the sort of directly historical part of our talk, I'm going to tell you a story, and I'm going to tell you this, I'm going to warn you in advance, this is an extremely grim story. Because I'm a historian of modern Germany, that is to say I have a doctorate in modern German history, one of the things that happens to you with this is that you get to become very familiar with the literature about the Holocaust. And as I think I said in one of these previous talks, I know a lot of things that I dearly wish I could forget. But this is one of them, and this story could stand in for a lot of others. In August of 1941, the Sixth Army was passing around an area, had just passed beyond an area in the Ukraine called Bila, Tserkva. And a number of pastors went to this fellow, whose name is Helmut Grosskurt, who was the officer, a lieutenant colonel commanding the 295th Infantry Battalion, and told him that there was an orphanage in which about 90 Jewish children were being held. Their parents had already been shot, and they were scheduled to be executed. These were children from infants up to about 7 years old. So Grosskurt went to have a look at this, and he found in a building these children, many of them in rags, some of them naked, a room full of infants with dirty diapers everywhere. And so he went to the head of the local SD, who was this guy, Paul Blobel, and told him that there weren't, to call off the executions. Blobel said, well, you can't tell me to do that. And Grosskurt said, well, actually I can, because in the areas directly behind the combat areas, the military had said, even though, Blobel was a Standartenführer, which is the SS has its own ranks, but it's basically equivalent to a colonel. Grosskurt was a lieutenant colonel, but Grosskurt, because he was a Wehrmacht frontline commander, was able to say this. So Grosskurt said, well, I'm contacting Walter von Reichenau, who's that guy right there, and to tell him what's going on and to sort of put a stop to this. And Blobel said, well, this can't happen. I think that Blobel said, I think that the units that were snooping around for this should be made to do the shooting, and that the person who initiated this, i.e. Grosskurt himself, should be made to supervise it. And Grosskurt told him calmly that that wasn't going to happen, and that he was waiting for a judgment from Reichenau as to what should happen. A few hours later, Reichenau got back to him and said, the Hitler policy on this and the policy of the army is very clear. The shootings are going to go ahead, and you shouldn't have even written the letter that you wrote to me. And the next day, the Wehrmacht soldiers in the area dug a pit. They put the children in tractors, took them out there and shot them. They, in fact, to spare the feelings of the Sonderkommando, had Ukrainian militiamen do it. And the militiamen were so sort of devastated by this that they didn't pay very good attention to where they were shooting people, and sometimes they had to shoot some of the children 4 or 5 times in order to kill them. Now, why am I telling you this horrible story? Because as we go on, you may develop a sense of sympathy for the men in the Sixth Army. Don't. These people murdered their way across the Ukraine. Soldiers have to kill people. That's the downside of being a soldier. But this is not being a soldier. And this is one of hundreds of cases where Wehrmacht was directly involved in killing operations that were absolutely merciless. Reichenau was the head of the Sixth Army. He knew exactly what was going on, and he was a convinced anti-Semite. The 4 pastors who brought it to Grosskreuz's attention already knew that the adults had all been shot. Didn't do anything about that. So you should remember, if you start to feel pangs of sympathy for the German soldiers that got themselves involved in this, that this is the kind of thing that they were responsible for. So the story of the Battle of Stalingrad is there are no real heroes here. And you should remember the sort of people that we're talking about. So the Battle of Stalingrad was the sort of ultimate moment of the conflict between Stalin and Hitler and the sort of systems that they promoted. Stalin, by 1926, had become the sort of heir of Lenin. There's a whole other lecture I could give about how he sort of deformed Leninism, which was itself a weird sort of deformation of Marxism. But essentially, what he created was a highly structured top-down system. People talk about Stalin, excuse me, and also Hitler as being crazy. And in a sense, I mean, they had sort of they probably appear somewhere on the psychopath scale if like you consulted the psychologists. But they were very intelligent and very cagey. They were not like psychotics. They may have been slightly psychopathic. But they were just bad. I mean, there's no two ways. There's no other way to put this. I mean, if we say they were crazy, we sort of give them an out. What in fact they were was just bad. And there's just but this is a funny thing about the way the human mind works. Both these guys really thought that they were ultimately good people. Hitler thought he was, Hitler liked small dogs and children, just not Jewish children. But so the struggle that went on between the two systems was, for both men, viewed as the fundamental struggle in the world at that time. Stalin and his sort of take on communism was that viewed National Socialism as kind of the final phase of capitalism. That was the point at which capitalism could no longer be sort of democratic, and it had to use sort of brute force to control the workers, et cetera, et cetera. And this was the line that Stalin forced on the communist parties of Western Europe, and the German Communist Party particularly. So there was a moment at which the German Communist Party slightly collaborated with the Nazis in their sort of like legislative period, because the German communists believed with Stalin that hastening the rise of National Socialism would hasten the destruction of capitalism. This was a stupid idea for which a lot of them paid with their lives. Similarly, Hitler viewed Stalinism, communism, as the central problem of the modern world. And he sort of united it in his mind with the problem of Judaism, which he really did think was the main problem in the modern world. Contrary to what one might expect, this didn't stop them from signing a mutual defense pact in 1939, this Hitler-Stalin pact, sometimes called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, after the foreign ministers who negotiated it. There's a lot of really funny sort of cartoon work about this. This is from the London Evening Standard, and you can see Hitler saying, "Scum of the earth, I believe," and Stalin saying, "Bloody assassin of the workers, I presume." And you can see, if you could see it clearer, there are clearer versions of this that have Poland written on the back of that the person lying face down between them. And that was really the sort of idea on both sides was, let's take a little time to get ready for what we know is going to happen, and in the meantime we'll dismember Poland. But it was never really going to last. And weirdly enough, it was Stalin who was like more convinced that it was going to last than Hitler, so that when the Nazis started moving lots and lots of military forces up to the dividing line in the early days of summer of 1941, and communist officials kept, sending communiques back to Moscow saying, I think something bad is about to happen here. Stalin kept saying, no, the Germans aren't going to attack now, which turned out to be a gross miscalculation on his part. And as I'm sure a lot of you know, on the 22nd of June, 1941, Operation Barbarossa began. German forces, along with Romanians, Hungarians, some Italians, a few other satellite troops, streamed across the borders of the Soviet Union on a long front stretching from Archangel up in the north all the way to heading for the Black Sea coast in the south. There's a sort of underlying point here to the German attack, and it's this. The Nazis had this sort of racial ideal of Aryanism. You always have to sort of use Aryans in scare quotes because it's not a scientific term. There is no... Aryans were a kind of ethnic group in northern India a long time ago. And there's a weird kind of Nazi whatever that makes them into the sort of precursors of white Europeans, but it's complete and total hogwash. But there's this the sort of fundamental idea of National Socialism is that the world is basically structured by this eternal struggle between Aryans and races related to them, Western Europeans of various kinds, and Jews. The Volksgemeinschaft, the national community, was sort of like essential community. And it's funny because he sort of like thought that the Jews had a sort of... The Jews in a weird way were a sort of reverse image of this idea. So there was a fundamental thing that connected all Aryans together. And he also thought that there was a sort of fundamental thing that connected all Jews together. So that even if you didn't know you were Jewish, you were still manifested these Jewish characteristics. And I'll just sort of tell you as an aside that when they instituted the Nuremberg laws in the early 30s after the Nazis came to power, and everybody had to go to the local office and show that they had 4 quarterings of Aryan blood. Lots of people, if one of your grandparents was Jewish, that was probably okay, especially if it was a woman, one of your grandmothers. 2 meant you were like a second-degree Mischling, and then you started to have problems. But a lot of people went to those offices, or a certain number of them, and found out for the first time in their lives that they were Jews, because they had never sort of been culturally Jewish. The Jewish community in Germany was probably the most integrated, locally integrated community of any of the Jewish communities in Europe. In the Nazi idea, Judaism and Bolshevism were 2 sides of the same coin. So Russian communism, Stalinism, is basically the expression of a sort of Jewish idea. If you read the sort of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is one of these sort of fundamental anti-Semitic texts, you find that Jews are blamed for everything, every sin you can imagine. So communism and capitalism, and every other thing in between. I mean, just every bad thing. Also attached to this was the idea that the sort of Aryan people were going to need Lebensraum, living space. And the idea was that they would just clear out the peoples to the east. Slavs were down the racial hierarchy. And actually Martin Bormann, who was Hitler's sort of secretary, one of his secretaries, said, when they got out there, I mean, part of the plan is that 20 million Russians are going to starve to death. And also there were sort of communities of ethnic Germans living out in Russia, in the Baltics, and the idea was that they would be sort of brought into the sort of fold. Anyway, this is a sort of a German propaganda poster, and it says, victory or Bolshevism. You see like a nice, beautiful blonde woman with her beautiful blonde child, and then you see this like filthy, sort of Jewish-looking Bolshevik, You don't have to read German, I think, to see what the point of this, the ultimate point of this. So the fight on the Eastern Front was always going to be more than just about territory, more than just about sort of an international squabble. It was a fight that both sides saw as really fundamental, a fundamentally systemic struggle. This is the Commissar Befehl, or the Commissary Order, and essentially what it is an order that Hitler promulgated, the substance of which was as follows. This is an actual copy, and in German, which you don't read, so I'm just going to tell you what it says, which is, when fighting Bolshevism, one cannot count on the enemy acting in accordance with principles of humanity or international law. In particular, it must be expected that the treatment of our prisoners by the political commissars of all types, that is, say, like the political officials of the Communist Party, who are the true pillars of resistance, will be cruel, inhuman, and dictated by hate. Troops must realize that in this fight, it is wrong to trust such elements with clemency and consideration in accordance with international law. They are a menace to our own safety and to the rapid pacification of the conquered territories. That the originators of the Asiatic barbaric methods of fighting are the political commissars. They must be dealt with promptly and with the utmost severity. Therefore, if taken while fighting or offering resistance, they must, on principle, be shot immediately. Stalin sort of followed up this by essentially letting it be known that any SS soldier who was captured should be summarily executed. And that was par for the course for 1941, I mean, when things got going here. So once again, what we have is an intense ideological struggle, not just, I mean, think about the Civil War, the American Civil War, which is very intense, right? But think about that sort of moment, if any of you have ever read The Passing of the Armies by Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, that sort of moment at the end when the Confederates have stacked arms and are sort of marching away, and Chamberlain has his men come to attention and salute the defeated foe, because in fact you had to recognize the nobility of your foe. There was none of this stuff on the Eastern Front. Operation Barbarossa ended up sort of bogging down. The idea was that it would just be a sort of on to Moscow. Those of you who saw the Napoleon lecture that I gave, I mean, this is the sort of this is the idea that everybody has, we'll just go to like Russia's big, and the Germans didn't have a great respect for the Red Army, and they had a lot of reason for this. In 1937, Stalin had executed a purge, and I do mean executed, of the upper echelons of the Red Army, in which something like, I think, 37,000 officers were executed. So the Red Army was not very well organized at that time. Also, in the course of the fighting in 1941, the Red Army would sort of hold every place that they were to the last man, or alternatively, they would just disintegrate. And thus the Wehrmacht was able to advance pretty close to Moscow and very far, like through Belarus, through the Ukraine. I'll just tell you, this is an interesting point, and it's apropos of nothing, but there's a really good book about the Holocaust in Belarus called Marching into Darkness. I think we have it upstairs. But one of the big sort of things that the Einsatzgruppen were always trying to do was like get the locals into the whole killing thing. And it varied, the success of it varied from place to place. In the Ukraine, they had absolutely no problem, apparently. Like the locals, in a number of places, and this happened in Poland too, started killing Jews even without being prompted. In Belarus, there's letters we have sort of from the Einsatzgruppen leaders where they're like, we just can't get the locals into this thing. Like they can't figure out sort of why it is. But anyway, so they had conquered much of this territory by the time the end of 1941 rolled around, and winter campaigning in Russia, as Napoleon discovered, is a terrible idea. It's very difficult. You face Russian winter, temperatures can get down to minus 20 to minus 30. That's Celsius, but still it's minus 12 to minus 15 Fahrenheit. And any of you who own a diesel car will know what unfortunate consequences this will have, like diesel gels at about 5 Fahrenheit. So you have to have special lubricants. And actually the Red Army knew this, so you can see this is a series of counterattacks that the Red Army staged starting in December of 1941 and into May of 1942. One of the big goals of the German attack was rather more prosaic than the sort of racial struggle, although that was important too. And it was the desire for resources. Hitler and his generals understood that in order to really prosecute the war that they wanted to prosecute, they needed oil, particularly. And about 80% of the oil in the Soviet Union came from this peninsula here, where the city of Baku is. But in between that, in between the Wehrmacht and that, was the Caucasus Mountains, which are high, have very few passes, and are easily defended. And so it was incumbent on, the idea that Hitler had was, Army Group South will get to the Caucasus sometime in high summer 1942. This was part of what was called Plan Blue, which we're going to talk about. Get through the Caucasus, get down into the oil-producing regions of Russia. They wanted to get, there's another city, I wonder if it's on this map. There's a city up in this region called Maikop, and that's another large oil-producing region. So the idea was, we'll seize Maikop, we'll get down through the Caucasus in summer when the passes are open. You might think to yourself, well, why can't they go this way? That's a very marshy area, and you can't operate armor through it, pretty much. So the idea was, get through the passes in the Caucasus during summer, seize the oil, and then we can fight the war for however long we need to. Operation Blue was the plan for renewing the fight in the summer of 1942. And it involved the German 6th Army and the 4th Panzer Army under Hermann Hoth stabbing westward. Now, interestingly, Stalin thought that what the Germans really wanted was to get to Moscow. But Hitler didn't really care about Moscow very much. He was much more interested in the resources of the Caucasus. Later, he thought to himself, well, if I get that, like Moscow, I can just sort of will rot on the vine. So the real thrust of Operation Blue was down here across the River Donets into the Don area, particularly the Don Bend right here, and toward Stalingrad right there. Stalingrad was a major communication center. It was a large factory town. It was originally called Tsaritsa. It was the sort of gateway to Asia under the Tsars. And was a showpiece town, really. In 1925, Stalin changed the name to sort of memorialize it. Stalin was a Georgian from down sort of this area here, and had sort of fought against the sort of white, that is to say, the sort of Tsarist counter-revolution. And so there was a lot of fighting around Tsaritsa, so he changed the name to kind of memorialize that. And of course, Stalin was like a complete and total narcissist, so he changed it to his own name. Something I should mention too, when I say armies here, what we're talking about is field armies. And these are generally groupings of anywhere from 100 to 220,000 troops. The German, the structure of the Wehrmacht was such that armies would tend to have both armored and mechanized, and not both, would tend to have all three, armored, mechanized, and infantry formations within them, except for designated panzer armies, like tank armies, like the 4th Panzer Army under Hermann Hoth. Operation Blue kicked off in the last week of June with 74 divisions between Oriel, which is up on the sort of Donets, the central Donets, and Taganrog, which is right on the Black Sea coast, or on the Sea of Azov, excuse me. And at first it went quite well, except for the following. It was meant as a sort of large pincer operation. Now, earlier in May, the Germans had fought a battle, the Second Battle of Kharkov, in which they had captured 300,000 Red Army troops in a large sort of pincer operation. And part of the reason was, once again, the Red Army didn't retreat. Sometimes you got to retreat, you know.
Stalin forbade any retreating.
Well, he did. I mean, but after Kharkov, they learned sort of lesson. And so when the pincers closed for Operation Blue, all they got were sort of stragglers and rear guards, because the Red Army had learned in the intervening period how to do fighting retreats, how to construct multiple lines of defense so that you don't end up getting these big, large encirclements. They really learned to fight a modern war in the course of the early part of 1942. And in fact, you can see that in a number of cases, they were allowed to retreat by Stalin up to a certain point, and we'll get to that in a moment. By July 5th, elements of 4th Panzer Army had gotten to Voronezh, which is up here. I'm not sure it's on this map. It's up. There it is, Voronezh. But they had gone so far, so fast, that they were getting to the end of their supply lines. And that's the problem with, particularly with armored formations. That, you know, there's the old adage about an army marches on its stomach, but, you know, tanks march on their gas tank because they get about, you know, 1.5 miles to the gallon. So you need to have your other formations around. You also need to not get isolated, and we'll talk about this in a little bit. But in the sort of center part where 6th Army was attacking, they made pretty good progress. But further south, around Rostov, on the lower Don, where they were fighting to try and secure the Don crossings, the resistance was very tough. And so Hitler thought, well, the center of the Red Army is just collapsing. They're running out of people. That's why I'm only getting sort of stragglers and rear guards. And so he shifted 4th Panzer Army and the armored elements of the 6th Army south to assist in the fight for the Don crossings in Rostov. And this fight happened until about the end of July. And this is important for a number of reasons. One is the Don Steppe, which is this area here, is probably the most perfect area for armored operations in the entire Eurasian area. I mean, it's hard ground, it's flat, tanks can move very easily from place to place. But the area around Rostov is very marshy. And also, what they discovered in Rostov was that instead of just willy-nilly holding any strong point, the Red Army had converted the city into a fortress with a series of mutually supporting strong points and kill zones. And it took them the best part of 3 weeks to finally take Rostov. And while they did this, the rest of the southwestern front of the Red Army was able to move back so that they weren't encircled by the advance of the 6th Army further north. And this is key. Once again, the Red Army was learning to fight a modern war. They were learning to fight the war that they could fight. The Wehrmacht was all about mobility. I mean, they had conquered France, they had conquered Western Russia by moving along quickly with motorized units. And what the Red Army said sort of was, well, that's great, but let's get you into the cities and see how you fight there. And this would be definitive for a lot of things that happened later on. So once Rostov was taken, Hitler decided to reorganize his forces again. And he sent the elements of the 4th Panzer Army and he sent two motorized and 3 panzer divisions north to try and help Paulus' 6th Army, which was now fighting in the Don Bend, right here, and which was fighting heavy resistance. At about this time, while the Red Army was, in fact, learning to fight in this new way, Stalin issued Order number 227. Part of the text reads as follows. Some foolish people at the front comfort themselves by saying that we can always retreat further east, since we have so much territory, much land and manpower, and that we will always have more than enough grain. They say this to excuse their shameful conduct at the front, but such talk is lies and falsehood and only helps our enemies. After the loss of the Ukraine, Belarusia, the Baltic lands, the Donbass, and other regions, we have much less territory, far fewer people, much less grain and metal, fewer factories and industrial plants. To retreat any further would be to ruin ourselves and our motherland. Every little scrap of land that we give up strengthens our enemy and weakens our defense, our motherland. And so the time for retreating is over. Not one step back. Nijagu najad. That must now be our watchword. And the rest of this is, I mean, it's really compelling stuff. Like if you look it up on Wikipedia, they have like a large portion of the text. And Russian soldiers really took that as, now we're really going to get serious about this, the soldiers of the Red Army. It's worth talking too about the sort of motivations, and we'll get into this a little more as we talk about some of the fighting in Stalingrad. But people there's this sort of idea about totalitarianism that everyone's some sort of robot who just goes sort of marching forward, and it's not really true. Totalitarianism is a concept with a lot of problems to start out with, but the way Soviet society worked was very complicated, and it intermixed a lot of things. It intermixed severe political repression with intense patriotism, and also a lot of people who really legitimately thought communism was a great idea. All 3 of those things were active. And it's not like they were just a bunch of drones. I mean, those of you who know about the sort of military science or the sort of technology part of this will know that the T-34 Russian battle tank was arguably the best tank ever built at any point. I mean, they started building in 1939 or 40. Someone know?
T-34, I think, was developed in 1934.
But the Germans hadn't even really seen one until the second day of Operation Barbarossa. As a matter of fact, there's a story that one German tanker told that he said they came upon this T-34 at a sort of strong point, and they all started shooting at it. And he said it sounded like a drum beat. You could hear all the hits on the tank sounded like a drum beat, and nothing happened. And then the T-34 was shooting back, and finally the guys in the T-34 just ran out of ammunition, got out of the tank, and sort of ran. They spiked the breach and ran to the rear. But the Germans, the only thing that they had that could really punch a T-34 was an 88 millimeter cannon, which, okay, now I'm going to tell you something more obscure. 88 millimeter cannon, some of you may already know this, but I'll just tell you for those who don't, was originally an anti-aircraft gun. During the Spanish Civil War, the crews found out that it was also very effective for, if you could get the angle low enough, for shooting at opposing armor. And so for that reason, every German division had in it at least one unit of 88s who could work either as flak protection or as tank destroyers. The Germans for a while, so they made the Mark III. The Mark III turned out to be, they made a lot of them, but turned out that they couldn't really, the T-34 was so much better than a Mark III that they had to sort of abandon it. What they found out was that you could take a Mark III chassis, mount an 88 on it, and they turned it into something called a Stug 3, that was essentially a tank destroyer. The Panzer Mark, the Mark IV turned out to be sort of more effective.
Is that the Elephant?
Yeah, I think that may be one.
Like I think a tiger body.
Yeah, they. I'll talk about. Okay, I'm going to get back to the topic in a second here, but I'll just tell you this one other sort of obscure fact, which we'll talk about more when I talk about the Battle of the Bulge in a couple of months. The Army War College did a study of tank engagements from the Second World War on the Western Front, and they studied something like 500 or 600 of them, and they found out that there was one factor. Tom knows the punchline of this story, so he can't answer the following question, but there was one factor that determined who won a tank-on-tank engagement more than any other. Does anyone know what that one factor was? Who was the first to engage? Statistically, if you got the first shot off, your chances of winning went way up. If you didn't, they went way down. But anyway, we'll talk about, my grandfather was a tank commander, and I have like a sort of soft spot in my heart for that, so we'll talk about it more in the Battle of the Bulge. So the Germans, the Sixth Army under Paulus, so let's talk about Friedrich Paulus. Sometimes it's called Friedrich von Paulus. His family his father was a schoolmaster from somewhere in Saxony, I think. And he had bought you could buy sort of patents of nobility if you had enough money. But he was really sort of middle class. He was Walter von Reichenau's sort of protege. Reichenau, in December or January of end of 1941-42, this is the guy who okayed the murder of the children at Bila Tserkva, decided one day to go out for his daily jog when it was minus 20 Celsius. And got back, wasn't feeling so good, and had a brain aneurysm. Yeah, I know, leaving the world no poorer, I'm afraid. And so Paulus became the head of the Sixth Army. Paulus, who had never really commanded anything larger than about a battalion, was then in command of the Sixth Army. Hitler kind of liked him. And that was the way things got done in the Third Reich. That sort of helped. So at this point, with the added armor formations, the Wehrmacht starts in the end of July and the beginning of August, advancing across the Don and towards Stalingrad on the Volga. And what happens is that one particular unit, the 16th Armored Division, actually outpaced everybody and got to the Volga first, just north of Stalingrad, which turned out to be a kind of a mixed blessing for them, because then they were sitting there without their infantry cover and without their motorized formations, and they spent about 4 or 5 days absorbing furious Russian counterattacks. And eventually what happened was a sort of corridor was formed here. And while at the same time, the 4th Panzer Army came up from the south. So a sort of salient was formed here. You can see Stalingrad here. And there was a kind of a bubble that partly was formed by a sort of corridor that the 16th Armored made here north of Stalingrad. Hitler told Paulus, okay, so what you need to do is pinch out that salient. So you need the 4th Panzer Army is going to attack from the south. You need to send all your motorized units from the corridor north of Stalingrad to attack from the north, and you'll pinch out the salient and catch 2 Soviet armies, 2 Soviet field armies, the 62nd and the 64th, I think. But just as this was about to happen, overall control of the Red Army in this area was then taken over by Marshal Zhukov. And Zhukov launched a series of attacks, particularly using the 5th Tank Army, the Russian 5th Tank Army. They staged a series of very heavy attacks on the northern flank corridor, with the result that the mobile units from the 16th, from the 6th Army and from the 16th Panzer Division were tied up for 3 days. And in those 3 days, the 62nd and 64th Armies of the Red Army retreated into Stalingrad, which essentially ensured that taking the city was going to be extremely long and extremely difficult. And now we're getting into late August. And nobody has to be told what's coming. I mean, the Russian winter is absolutely legendary. So starting on the 28th of August, the German 4th Air Fleet starts softening up Stalingrad. Stalin had forbidden, so one thing that happened, I got in a big argument with somebody one time in a class in graduate school because he was like, well, you know, the Russian people spontaneously up and, you know, burned their fields and went to the east, which is not true, sadly. In fact, this was organized by the government, and the idea was the sort of scorched earth policy. We're just not going to leave them. There's a long way out there in Western Russia. We're not going to leave them any resources to sort of support themselves. Stalin had forbidden the population of Stalingrad to leave, the civilian population, and the reason he gave was soldiers will fight harder for a live city than for a dead one. So that Stalingrad was actually full of civilians at this point, and when the Stalingrad it's on a series of kind of rocky bluffs along the river Volga, with the river Tserkva going through. The southern part is mostly, or was mostly, wooden buildings. There's a large grain silo here that sort of dominated the area. A modern center of the city, and then in the north, factory districts with 3 large factories, the Red October, the Barricadi, and the Dzerzhinsky, with workers housing around them. At the end of August, starting on the 28th of August, the 4th Air Fleet starts bombing Stalingrad, starting a firestorm that killed probably about 40,000 people, mostly civilians. The southern part of the city, which was mostly wood buildings, just completely went up in flames. And then you can see the Wehrmacht in the course of the month of September. So this is where they were on September 12th, and this is where they are, this dotted line. You can see there's the ferry crossing, which they never managed to take. This dotted line is where they are on the 30th of February. Of September, not February, thank you. Those who could actually read the thing will know that how far in error I was. But what they discover is, once again, this is going to be a rather different fight than fighting out on the plains and the War of Motion. I have a few pictures, too. This is looking down the Tsaritsa Gorge from the west, looking east towards Stalingrad. You can see sort of ruined buildings. This is middle of September 1942. This is fighting in the Red October factory. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but you can kind of see just sort of like the fighting in Stalingrad was very intense and in the sort of the rubble of a sort of mostly destroyed city. These are Russian children in an air raid shelter. I mean, it's just intense to think, like, especially any of you who have or have had children, the idea of, like, you know, what that must have been like for them. And that's the thing, you know, like that story at the beginning, like I have a 20-month-old son, and I just think, like, how could you look at a small child and think it would be okay to kill them? But I particularly look at that little kid and I think, like, God, what is he looking at? And maybe you should get under cover right now. These are Katyusha rockets. Katyusha was one of the most effective weapons used by the Red Army. Like, just from those pictures, you can sort of get the impression of how utterly terrifying being on the wrong end of a Katyusha rocket strike must have been like. And it's just, when you see those, like, that film of, like, the Katyusha launchers going off, like, God, it's just terrifying. It's terrifying to even watch. The Russians, the Red Army had converted Stalingrad. They had a lot of time to think about this, and they had converted it into a series of fortresses with mutually defensible points and kill zones set up. They also never lost control of the eastern bank of the Volga, so they were able to fire Katyushas and artillery shells at will, and they had measured out exactly where they were going to hit. So they had set up fields of fire already by the time the Germans arrived, by the time the Wehrmacht arrived. I'm going to read you now some selections from a diary. This is from a German soldier named Wilhelm Hoffmann. Hoffmann wrote these diary entries between the end of the sort of beginning of August 1942 and December of 1942. He was killed sometime after that in Stalingrad, and the diary was recovered by a Red Army soldier and sort of passed to the back, and that's how it sort of got out. August 12th. We're advancing towards Stalingrad along the railway line. Yesterday, Russian Katyusha rocket launchers, and then tanks halted our regiment. The Russians are throwing in their last forces, Captain Werner explained to me. Large-scale help is coming up for us. The Russians will be beaten. This morning, outstanding soldiers were presented with decorations. Will I really go back to Elsa without decoration? I believe that for Stalingrad, the Fuhrer will decorate even me. August 23rd, splendid news. North of Stalingrad, our troops have reached the Volga and captured part of the city. The Russians have two alternatives, either to flee across the Volga or give themselves up. Our company's interpreter has interrogated a captured Russian officer. He was wounded, but asserted that the Russians would fight for Stalingrad to the last round. Something incomprehensible is in fact going on. In the north, our troops capture part of Stalingrad and reach the Volga, but in the south, the doomed divisions are continuing to resist bitterly. Fanaticism. August 27th. A continuous cannonade on all sides. We're slowly advancing, less than 20 miles to go to Stalingrad. In the daytime, we can see the smoke of fires. At nighttime, the bright glow. They say that the city is on fire. On the Führer's orders, our Luftwaffe has sent it up in flames. That's what the Russians need to stop them from resisting. September 5th. Our regiment has been ordered to attack Sadovaya Station. I'll show you where that is, actually, because I haven't. That's Sadovaya Station right here in the southern part of the city. Are the Russians really thinking of holding out in the city itself? We had no peace all night from the Russian artillery and airplanes. Lots of wounded are being brought by. God protect me. Now, at this time, too, for a lot of the period that we're talking about, the Germans had had complete air superiority. The Luftwaffe had had pretty complete air superiority. But in the middle of 1942, at the end of 1942 more, but in the middle too, the Yak-9 fighter plane came online. And that's probably the best plane that the Soviets ever produced. I mean, the best pre-jet plane that they produced. And that actually could hold up. The Red Air Force was not, it took a while to sort of get going. And you know the thing about, you know, the Air Force, when you're going up against better pilots, it's hard to sort of learn without getting killed in the process. So it took them a long time to get up to speed. But by the winter of 1942, they were having much better luck asserting some sort of aerial control, and thus were able to attack German ground forces from the air, particularly at night. September 8th, 2 days of nonstop fightings. The Russians are defending themselves with insane stubbornness. Our regiment has lost many men from the Katyusha, which belch out terrible fire. I've been sent back to work at Battalion HQ. It must be my mother's prayers that have taken me away from the company's trenches. September 11th. Our battalion is fighting in the suburbs of Stalingrad. We can see the Volga. Firing is going on all the time. Wherever you look, there is fire and flames. Russian cannon fire and machine guns are firing out of the burning city. Fanatics. September 13th. An unlucky number. This morning, Katyusha attacks caused the company heavy losses. 27 dead and 50 wounded. The Russians are fighting desperately like wild beasts. Don't give themselves up, but come close and then throw grenades. Lieutenant Krauss was killed yesterday and there is no company commander. September 16th. Our battalion plus tanks is attacking the grain storage elevator. This is a very famous fight that happened. The grain silo was right there. Our battalion plus tanks is attacking the grain storage elevator, from which smoke is pouring. The grain in it is burning. The Russians seem to have lit it themselves. Barbarism. The battalion is suffering heavy losses. There are not more than 60 men left in each company. The elevator is occupied not by men, but by devils that no flames or bullets can destroy. September 18th. Fighting is going on inside the elevator. The Russians inside are condemned men, but the battalion commander says the commissars have ordered the men to die in the elevator. If all the buildings of Stalingrad are defended like this, none of our soldiers will get back to Germany. I had a letter from Elsa today. She's expecting me home when victory is won. September 20. The battle for the elevator is still going on. The Russians are firing on all sides. We stay in our cellar. You can't go out into the street. Sergeant Major Nushka was killed today running across the street. Poor fellow, he's got 3 children. September 22nd. The Russian resistance in the elevator has been broken. Our troops are advancing toward the Volga. Our soldiers have never experienced such bitter fighting before. Inside the elevator, we found only 40 dead Russians. September 26th. Our regiment is involved in constant heavy fighting. After the elevator was taken, the Russians continued to defend themselves just as stubbornly. You don't see them at all. They've established themselves in houses and cellars and are firing on all sides, including from our rear. Barbarians, they use gangster methods. In the blocks captured 2 days ago, Russian soldiers appeared from somewhere or other, and fighting has flared up with fresh vigor. Our men are being killed not only in the firing line, but in the rear, in buildings we have already occupied. The Russians have stopped surrendering at all. If we take any prisoners, it's because they are hopelessly wounded and can't move by themselves. Stalingrad is hell. Those who are merely wounded are lucky. They will doubtless be at home and celebrate victory with their families. Now, at this time, it was still possible to be evac'd out of Stalingrad and to a couple of air bases that the Luftwaffe had established further in the rear. October 3rd. After marching through the night, we've established ourselves in a shrub-covered gully. We are apparently going to attack the factories. So this is the area up north now, the Red October, the Barkady, and the Dzerzhinsky. Behind them is the Volga. We have entered a new area. It was night, but we saw many crosses with our helmets on top. Have we really lost so many men? Damn this Stalingrad. October 4th. Our regiment is attacking the Barkady settlement. A lot of Russian Tommy gunners have appeared. Where are they bringing them from? Well, where they're bringing them from is across the river. And this is a sort of fascinating thing. So one historian that I read said that by the time the Red Army troops got up to the front, they were already veterans because they'd had to cross the Volga under fire and then basically sort of fight their way up to where the front lines were. October 5th. Our battalion has gone into the attack 4 times and got stopped each time. Russian snipers hit anyone who shows himself carelessly from behind shelter. October 10th. The Russians are so close to us that our planes cannot bomb them. We're preparing for a decisive attack. The Fuhrer has ordered the whole of Stalingrad to be taken as rapidly as possible. October 14th. It has been fantastic since morning. Our airplanes and artillery have been hammering the Russian positions for hours on end. Everything in sight is being blotted from the face of the earth. October 22nd. Our regiment has failed to break into the factory. We have lost many men. Every time you move, you have to jump over bodies. You can scarcely breathe in the daytime. There is nowhere and no one to remove the bodies, so they are left there to rot. Who would have thought 3 months ago that instead of the joy of victory, we would have to endure such sacrifice and torture, the end of which is nowhere in sight? The soldiers are calling Stalingrad the mass grave of the Wehrmacht. There are very few men left in the companies. We have been told we are soon going to be withdrawn and brought back up to strength. October 27th. Our troops have captured the whole of the Barkady factory, but we cannot break through the Volga. The Russians are not men, but some kind of cast iron creatures. They never get tired. They're not afraid of fire. We are absolutely exhausted. Our regiment now has barely the strength of a company. The Russian artillery on the other side of the Volga won't let you lift your head. October 28th. Every soldier sees himself to be a condemned man. The only hope is to be wounded and taken back to the rear. November 3rd. In the last few days, our battalion has several times tried to attack the Russian positions, to no avail. On this sector also, the Russians won't let you lift your head. There have been a number of cases of self-inflicted wounds and malingering among the men. Every day I write 2 or 3 reports about them. November 18th. Our attack with tanks yesterday had no success. After our attack, the field was littered with dead. On November 19th, Zhukov launched Operation Uranus, his counterattack against the German positions in Stalingrad. Paulus had systematically lied to Hitler about the significance of the force in front of him, had made it seem bigger than it was. And he had basically stripped all the sort of combat units out of the sides of the German. Basically, the Germans were now in a sort of salient position, the front of which was Stalingrad. November 19th, Zhukov sends 3 full field armies against the northern wing of the German salient, which is composed at this point of 2 Romanian armies. It starts with an extremely heavy artillery barrage that essentially causes the Romanian forces to disintegrate. The second attack begins on the southern flank, which is manned by Hungarians and Italians mostly, with similar results. By the 23rd of November, that's 4 days after the start, 265,000 troops of the Wehrmacht, some Italians and Romanians as well, are cut off in Stalingrad. Stalingrad, at this point, became also, just to sort of remind people, the middle of October, the Russian winter came early. By the middle of October, it was about 3 degrees Celsius. By the middle of November, it had gotten down to about 5 below Celsius. It bottomed out in late December at about minus 30 Celsius, which is in the minus teens. Which is bad news if you're outside. And the problem that Paulus had, and the reason why this happened, was that Paulus had really committed the last of his reserves. His goal was to get to the Volga. But they never managed to crush out the sort of, they got within about 300 yards. They got to the Volga in the southern part of Stalingrad. But in the northern part, in the factory district, they never got closer than about 300 yards to the Volga. And by the time they realized how far in it they were, Zhukov had launched the counterattack that basically trapped them in the city. Oops, where's my page here? So Stalingrad turns into this a place of real horror, a vortex of fire and noise, where small arms fire clattered incessantly, broken only by the rumble of artillery fire. The fighting became intense and personal. Oftentimes the front lines were the interior wall of a house, or the floors between 2 levels of the house. The battle spread beneath the city. Both the Red Army and the Wehrmacht started infiltrating heavily armed assault units into the sewers and underground tunnels of the city. The fighting in Stalingrad was a war to the knife, with no quarter asked and none given. No prisoners were taken. Nobody could take them. The Germans couldn't feed themselves, and the Russians mostly couldn't feed themselves either. But in any case, what we see here is a sort of consequence of this intense ideological warfare. It's no surrender, no, you fight to the last man in every sort of locale.
Didn't they call it the Rattenkrieg or Rat War?
Right, the rat fighting. They also refer to Stalingrad as the Kessel, or the cauldron. While this was going on, the southern wing of what was called Army Group A reached the Caucasus and found the oil fields of Maikop in flames. The commander of the German army there said that it would take a year of solid work to get them back in productive form. And so it was at that moment that they realized the utter vanity of what they'd been doing. They would not get the oil reserves that they were there seeking. The whole thing had been a failure. They had sent mountain divisions into the Caucasus to try and find their way through the passes, but by the middle of November, when the snows shut down the high passes, they were no closer to finding a way through the Caucasus. The attacks of the Red Army eventually pushed the elements of the Wehrmacht, part of the 4th Panzer Army was caught in Stalingrad. It was sort of sheared in half when the attacks on the southern part of the German salient happened. There's a book, actually, I've just gotten a copy of it by Hermann Hott, and it's really about Barbarossa, which is why I didn't bring it down, but Hermann Hott was the general commander of the 4th Panzer Army. It's a really sort of interesting book, but he was able to write it because he was in the part of the 4th Panzer Army that was like on the southern half of the shear and didn't end up actually inside Stalingrad. So Wolfram von Richthofen, who was a descendant of the famous Baron von Richthofen, and who was the commander of the German 4th Air Fleet, the Luftwaffe 4th Air Fleet, said that he could supply the Wehrmacht trapped in Stalingrad. But it turned out to be completely wrong. He was never able to get more than 118,000 tons of supplies in there in a day, and when you consider that with the number of people they had, the minimal requisite was 750,000 tons. Things quickly went from bad to really desperate. In the beginning of December, the Germans, in an attempt to rescue the 6th Army, launched Operation Wintergewitter, or Winter Storm. By the 18th, it was led by Erich von Manstein. By the 18th, von Manstein's forces were within 48 kilometers of Stalingrad. But several days in, Zhukov had launched Operation Little Saturn, which was his counteroffensive against Wintergewitter. And the Germans never got any closer, and within a few days after the 18th of December, were forced to retreat back into the Don Bend. On the 25th of December, German Nazi-controlled radio broadcast throughout the country a message from the troops of Stalingrad about how great things were going there, which was recorded in Berlin and was a complete fiction. All day, the Red Army piped in radio broadcasts to the German lines that said, every 7 seconds a German soldier dies in Stalingrad. Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. 24 hours, just to make the point. By the 14th of January, the Germans had lost control of the airfields that allowed them to get any supplies to Stalingrad whatsoever. By this time, the soldiers in the German army were receiving about 5 ounces of bread a day and were forced to eat all of the horses that they had brought with them and were pretty much out of food. On the 22nd of January, Paulus asked Hitler for permission to surrender. Hitler said no. On the 26th, the German forces in Stalingrad were cut into 2 pockets. On the 30th of January, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal, and there's a very distinct message to this. In the traditions of the German army, no German field marshal had ever been captured alive. Paulus said, the Fuhrer expects me to commit suicide for him, but I won't give the little Bohemian swine, the little Bohemian corporal, the satisfaction. On the 31st of January, Red Army forces captured Paulus's headquarters in the southern pocket. Then the fighting went on for 2 more days in the northern pocket. Finally, the general commanding the northern pocket, Paulus also had to issue an order to his soldiers that they were not allowed to stand on the lip of trenches so they could get shot. The commander of the northern pocket was told on the 31st of January that his adjutant had headed to the Red Army lines to negotiate a surrender, so he decided at that point that they should announce that they were surrendering. This is Paulus being led out of his bunker, which is sort of just behind. Paulus by this time had developed an intense tic, so that about every few seconds the right side of his face would sort of convulse because of the pressure that he was under. In all, roughly 90,000 soldiers of the Wehrmacht were captured in Stalingrad. Barely 6,000 of them ever returned to Germany, and mostly not until about 1957. They were kept in prisoner of war camps until that point.
They were used as construction slaves.
Yeah, and worse. Yeah, there's and this is it's just another interesting thing about Germany in the wake of the Second World War. This is the thing that was remembered. So there's a lot of movies that were made about this, about like, the missing husbands. This is the thing that sort of German popular culture remembered about the war, not the concentration camps or the mass killings, but the missing soldiers who were captured on the Eastern Front. I mean, the fighting on the Eastern Front was so horrible that it was like every German soldier's goal to find somewhere else to be.